The coils on that old stove glowed unevenly, flickering red, then dimming back down, like they were tired of fighting to stay alive. Honestly, the whole place felt like that. This roadside diner off Interstate 40 in Tennessee that seemed to hang on by a thread. My apron, once white, was a dingy gray now, stiff with grease no soap could wash away. I leaned over a catfish I'd just pulled from a half-melted box of ice, laid it on the scarred cutting board, its cloudy eye staring up at the ceiling like it had already given up. And I thought, yeah, I know that look. The back door slammed hard, and before I could even breathe, in barreled Mr. Sanders, the owner. He was a heavy man, barrel-chested with a gut straining against his shirt, his face always a blotchy red like it had been boiled in anger for years. He barked into the kitchen without even looking, his voice raw and sharp. When his eyes finally landed on me, he stabbed a thick finger in my direction like I was the problem he'd been chasing all night. You're supposed to be the cook, right? Well, get moving. His voice carried that edge, the kind of threat that makes your shoulders tense before your brain catches up. He leaned closer, breath sour with whiskey, and spat out his orders. Tonight's dinner had to impress. Some bankers from New York City were sitting out front, men with money and power who wanted something fancy. Fish chowder, baked catfish, something done right. And of course, his so-called head chef had disappeared on a 3-day bender, leaving me as the last one standing. "Don't screw this up," he growled. "If you ruin it, you'll regret it." I didn't argue. I didn't look him in the eye. I just nodded once, quiet, because sometimes survival means keeping your mouth shut. He seemed satisfied with that, slapped the doorframe with his hand, and grumbled his way back out toward the dining room, cursing under his breath about how he had to do everything himself. And just like that, it was me and the fish again, the clock ticking louder than anything else in that stifling kitchen. The banker's table was booked for 8, and the clock was already pushing past 7:30. Mr. Sanders stomped back into the dining room, cursing about how he had to do everything himself, his voice trailing off like an echo of bitterness. And just like that, I was alone again, left standing in that suffocating kitchen with the weight of it all pressing down on me. The air was thick, almost oily, every breath filled with the smell of burned grease that clung to the walls. The old exhaust fan moaned overhead, struggling against the smoke like it was on its last leg. My eyes moved across the shelves. Dusty jars of forgotten spices lined up like soldiers long past their prime, a jar of honey hardened into rock sugar, some unmarked bottle with no label left to read, and a lemon so dried out its skin had turned pale and chalky. It was pitiful, really, and in that moment the absurdity of it all nearly broke me. Because not so long ago, my world looked nothing like this. Back then, I was walking the sunlit streets of Napa Valley, surrounded by vineyards that stretched forever, the air thick with lavender and ripe grapes. I owned a restaurant, my restaurant, the Willow. We laid white tablecloths so crisp they seemed to glow, polished silver that sparkled in the candlelight, glasses of wine that caught the light like jewels. Conversations floated softly from table to table, never rushed, always refined. People waited months just for a chance to sit there. And my name, it wasn't just on the door, it was spoken with reverence. Rachel Moore, the woman who brought California wine country to life on a plate. Food critics wrote about me with admiration barely disguised, and I once even had a full magazine spread devoted to my story, my food, my vision. I still remember the flashbulbs, the applause that would erupt some nights when I came out to the dining room after service. For a time, I believed I had made it, that nothing could take that away from me. And now, here I was, sweating in a roadside diner's greasy kitchen, staring at jars of dust and a rotting lemon, trying to piece together something worthy of men who would never imagine the woman behind the stove once commanded a dining room full of applause. For a while, I was what they called a sensation, one of the few women chefs making waves in Napa Valley, the one who had built a name people actually whispered with admiration. I thought I had carved out something permanent, something untouchable. But turns out, All that glory was standing on a powder keg. When the fire came, it didn't just eat through wood and glass, it swallowed everything I had built. One night I had a dream, a future, and by morning there was nothing left but blackened walls and silence. Technically, the insurance should have saved me, but the papers weren't in my name. They were in my husband's. Marc Dupree, my charming Frenchman, moved faster than the flames. He cashed the check, bought himself a ticket, and disappeared to Miami, as if our marriage, our business, our life together had been nothing more than a pit stop. He didn't pick up when I called. He dodged every lawyer. He vanished into that humid Florida air like smoke, while I was left choking on ashes. And it wasn't just the restaurant that burned. It was my life, my reputation, my name. Years of sacrifice turned to nothing in hours. I walked through the ruins trying to salvage anything, even one pan, one book of recipes, but the only thing the fire chose to leave me was the scar on my face, not life-threatening, no, but visible, permanent, a reminder carved into my skin. Before, my face had been on glossy magazine covers, posters, press photos. After, it was something people glanced at with that careful pity, the kind that makes you want to sink through the floor. I hated that look more than the fire itself. The way strangers tilted their heads and softened their voices as if I had become a cautionary tale instead of a woman still standing. And so, with nothing left but shame and silence, I came back home, back to the States, back to the place that should have felt safe. But when I went to the high-end restaurants in New York, clutching my resume and my scars, the managers couldn't even meet my eyes. They smiled politely, voices smooth as glass, and told me they were looking for something else. What they meant was clear. Not you. In the kitchen, please, but not in the dining room. That's what they'd say, never once meeting my eyes. The words were always polite, professional even, but they carried the same sting every time. It was rejection wrapped in silk, and it cut just as deep. Humiliation after humiliation, glance after glance, until finally I just gave up. I couldn't keep proving myself to people who had already decided what I was worth. What I wanted wasn't recognition anymore. It was silence, just peace. So I left New York and went south to stay with my sister Emily. She lived in a small town off I-40, the kind of place where food magazines didn't circulate and no one cared about who had once been in them. Out there, I wasn't Rachel Moore, the Napa Valley chef who made headlines. I was just another woman trying to get by. There was a roadside diner not far from her house, a place people stopped only to grab cigarettes, gas station directions, maybe a plate of eggs before heading back on the road, and that's where I found myself. Emily didn't make a fuss about it. She just shrugged, practical as always, and said, "It's temporary, Rach. Things will work out. Just don't sit at home doing nothing. Go work a little." I didn't argue. Maybe I didn't even believe her, but sometimes you let someone else carry the hope for you when you can't. And that's how I ended up standing in that overheated, smoke-stained kitchen on that night, a dull knife in one hand and a catfish in front of me. The clock was ticking mercilessly toward 8, and out in the dining room, important men in suits waited while Mr. Sanders paced and barked like he owned me. I lowered my hands into a bowl of cold water, the sting shooting through my fingers, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something steady inside me. I started to clean the fish slowly, almost ceremoniously, the way I had been taught years ago in Lyon, under a chef so strict, he terrified us into perfection. He never tolerated rushing, but he demanded excellence. And in that shabby little diner, with a rusted scaler slipping in my hand, my movements were sharp, deliberate, almost reverent. My hands were freezing, but I didn't feel it. All I felt was the rhythm returning, like muscle memory waking up, like a piece of myself I thought I had lost suddenly sliding back into place. Once I locked into the work, it was like everything else faded. My eyes kept scanning the shelves, desperate for something I could use. Bay leaves, peppercorns, anything at all to give the broth a backbone. I pulled down dusty jars one by one, squinting at faded labels, twisting lids, sniffing the contents, hoping for a spark of life in a place that smelled mostly of grease and resignation. My whole focus narrowed to that search, as if the right spice could somehow anchor me in the middle of all this chaos. That's when I heard a voice at the doorway, soft but curious. It was Jake, the young waiter barely out of high school. He leaned against the frame like he wasn't sure if he should come in. "Whoa, Miss Rachel, you're actually cooking tonight?" he asked, his tone half joking, half awed. Without looking up, I said, "Bay leaves, Pepper, if you can find any," my eyes still darting along the shelves. He stepped into the room, sneakers squeaking against the sticky linoleum, and started scanning with me, and then the words just poured out of him, the way they do when a young kid finally finds someone to talk to. He rambled about how Alex, the line cook, always left everything in a mess, how no one but him could ever find anything, how he'd disappeared after his birthday party and hadn't been seen in 3 days. He said the boss was losing his mind, that the diner had hardly any customers left, no tips to speak of, and the whole place felt dead without Alex cracking jokes in the back. I let his chatter wash over me while I kept digging through the jars. His voice filled the silence of that kitchen, and for a moment I realized how lonely the place had been, how starved for even a scrap of real conversation. And then, almost like a small victory, I found what I needed. One jar still held a few brittle bay leaves. Another had peppercorns with just enough bite to wake the air when I crushed one between my fingers. I straightened, stretching my back, and finally looked at Jake. His face was so open, so eager to be useful, so desperate to be noticed. And for the first time that night, I felt something shift inside me. My lips tugged into the faintest smile, not for the spices I'd found, but because, even in this grimy kitchen, I suddenly wasn't completely alone. "I've got the bay leaves and the pepper," I said calmly, holding them up like proof that hope still existed in that kitchen. Then I paused, letting my mind reach for what would make the dish whole again. "But I'll need dry white wine. Doesn't matter the brand, just not sweet. And a fresh lemon, not moldy." Jake's face flushed red, and for a second he looked like a kid caught in trouble. White wine? A lemon? In this place? He shook his head, then added quickly, "I'll try to find something." And before I could answer, he bolted out the door, his sneakers slapping against the floor, as if his life depended on it. I turned back to the stove and began to build the base. Not just a broth, but the foundation of everything. I dropped onions into the pot, ones the last cook had tossed aside, their skins blotched and ugly, but inside still strong and firm. I knew how to coax the good out of what looked ruined. That had always been my gift, though I'd forgotten it until that moment. A wilted sprig of dill, a tired yellow pepper, into the pot they went, releasing themselves into the heat. And then, like magic, the air shifted. It had been years since anyone in that diner smelled something worth remembering. But suddenly the kitchen was alive again. The scent was bright and layered, herbs, roots, something deeper that wrapped itself around me like a long-lost friend. For the first time in ages, I felt like I was back where I belonged. Jake came rushing in, out of breath, a bottle in one hand and a lemon in the other. His grin was wide, almost boyish. "I found them," he announced, like he'd won a prize at the fair. He handed them over proudly. "Good job," I murmured, the corners of my mouth tugging into a smile I hadn't felt in months. I sliced the lemon, uncorked the wine, and added them with a steady hand. The clock struck 8, sharp and unyielding. Out in the dining room, 6 men in dark suits, but no ties, sat huddled together. Voices low, deliberate, their heads bent over papers marked with red ink. Deals, land, money, things far away from the life I was clinging to in that little kitchen. From the kitchen doorway, I could hear them, their voices low, measured, the kind of talk men use when money's on the line. One of them, older, steady, pointed to the map spread out across the table. The spots right off the interstate, good traffic flow, water and power already in place. Another leaned in, skeptical, but the access road's too narrow. A semi wouldn't make the turn. A third chimed in with reassurance. City Hall promised they'd approve the widening. Shouldn't be a problem. And then one of them said the words that made my chest tighten. Local owner, Sanders, might sell part of his land. The diner itself is nothing, but the location's visible. That's the value. Right on cue, Mr. Sanders practically leapt forward from where he'd been lurking, his face splitting into a greasy grin. "Gentlemen, finally welcome. I've heard about your plans, and let me tell you, you couldn't pick a better place. My property is the best around. Flat lot, great visibility, traffic flow like you wouldn't believe, almost like downtown New York." He puffed out his chest, smacked his tongue, and added with way too much pride, "I laid every brick here myself. And this diner? Solid business. Kitchen's top tier, chefs like the ones in Paris, I swear." The investors looked around, and I could tell they weren't buying it. One raised his brow at the peeling paint on the walls, another side-eyed the chipped sign hanging crooked outside, and the third just pressed his lips together like he was holding back a laugh. Finally, the oldest of the group spoke, his voice dry. "We'll see about the kitchen." Sanders scrambled, his words tumbling over themselves. Of course, I've prepared everything. Tonight we're serving chowder, family style, and baked catfish. I personally oversaw it. You'll be licking your fingers." He clapped his hands sharply, the sound cracking through the air. "Bring the first course. Hurry." Jake darted past me into the kitchen, breathless, like a boy carrying bad news. Meanwhile, out in the dining room, I could hear Sanders's shoes pounding nervously against the floor as he paced back and forth, waiting for the meal he thought would seal his future. I could feel the tension from the kitchen, even without seeing their faces. Sanders had put everything on this meal, betting his future on my hands without even realizing it. When Jake finally carried the tray out, the silence that followed felt louder than any outburst could have been. The men in their expensive jackets leaned forward, lifted their spoons, and tasted. No smiles, no nods, just silence. One furrowed his brow like he wanted to say something but thought better of it. Another raised his eyebrows, paused, then slowly nodded before sipping his water. Finally, in a voice cool and deliberate, one of them said, "That's interesting." They began whispering to each other, eyes flicking toward the kitchen. My heart beat faster, though I kept my hands busy, pretending not to care, and then one of them, the youngest, turned to Sanders and asked the question I'd been dreading and hoping for all at once. "Who's your chef?" I imagine Sanders' stomach dropped in that moment. He muttered something like, "Oh, just a woman in the back. Helps out. Relative of a cashier." But they weren't satisfied. "Bring her out," they said. Suddenly, the door to the kitchen slammed open, and there he was, Sanders, charging toward me like a bull. His face was blotched red, his eyes wild, his whole body bristling with rage. He got so close I could smell the whiskey on his breath, hot and sour. "What the hell did you put in that pot?" he hissed, his words dripping with venom. "They're out there frowning, whispering, and now they want to see you? What did you do?" He raised his hand like he might strike me, but instead he slapped the wall beside my head, the crack echoing through the cramped kitchen. I flinched instinctively, my whole body curling tight, but I refused to give him a sound. His breath was ragged, his eyes blazing, and all I could think was how small this man had always been, no matter how big he puffed himself up to look. Sanders grabbed my elbow, hissed something cruel in my ear, and shoved me toward the dining room. I wiped my hands on a rag, steadied myself, and stepped out. The silence hit like a wall, thick and absolute, and when I took a single step forward, I heard it, a collective intake of breath, half surprise, half pity. The harsh overhead light cut across my face, exposing the pale scar that ran from my cheek down to my neck, and I felt the weight of their eyes on me, but I didn't look away. My gaze was steady, tired but calm, as if I'd made peace with the fact that this was who I was now. The youngest man at the far end of the table rose first, his curiosity breaking through the silence. He asked if I had cooked the chowder, and when I nodded, he hesitated, fumbling for the right words before finally calling it remarkable. Clean balanced, nothing wasted, like a childhood memory you wished you'd lived but never did. Then the older man, the one with the map, pushed back his chair and began to clap, slow and deliberate, the sound echoing through the room. The others joined him in seconds, louder, stronger, until the applause filled every corner, and from the side of the room I saw Sanders freeze against the wall, his face drained of color, his whole body rigid like a man who suddenly realized the floor beneath him had disappeared. The silver-haired man studied me with narrowed eyes, and his voice carried the weight of recognition when he finally spoke. "Tell me, aren't you Rachel Moore, the Willow in Napa Valley?" For a breathless moment I stood frozen, my body locked in place, and then almost against my will, I gave the smallest nod, and in that quiet gesture, the past I thought I had lost forever came rushing back into the room. "Yes," I said softly, "that was me. Once." The silver-haired man's face lit up with sudden recognition. "Unbelievable," he exclaimed, his voice full of warmth. "You served monkfish fillet with lavender sauce, didn't you? I can still taste it. I proposed to my wife at your restaurant. That was you?" I felt my cheeks flush, my body stiffen with a kind of shy disbelief, and I nodded again, humbled and almost embarrassed. The table erupted in applause, louder this time, men clapping like they weren't just tasting soup, but rediscovering something they'd thought was lost. One of them leaned forward, eyes bright, and declared, "This is the best chowder I've had in 20 years. Then the older man fixed his gaze on me, his tone shifting from nostalgia to business. "Tell me," he said seriously, "are you employed right now?" I opened my mouth, but before I could speak, Sanders stumbled forward, trying to wedge himself into the moment. "Well, technically, she works for us." His voice faltered, his smile too wide, his presence desperate. I didn't even look at him. My eyes stayed locked on the investor, on the one person in the room who seemed to see me for who I was, not who I had become. He leaned forward, voice low but clear. "We're launching a new project in New York City, not just another bistro, an author's restaurant, something unique, something with a soul. We don't just need a chef. We need a name, a spirit. Do you understand?" He paused, letting the weight of it settle between us. "Would you be willing to lead the kitchen?" And just as my heart began to pound with the possibility, Sanders lunged to the table, forcing a laugh, his words tumbling out. "Gentlemen, since everything is going so well, perhaps we can also discuss my land. After all, I own everything here, the building, the lot, the kitchen, and this cook, she's mine too." Sanders spewed out his words, trying to sound bold, but his voice cracked under the strain, too loud, too rushed, the bluster of a man who already knew he was losing. The oldest investor raised his eyes slowly, taking his time, and looked at him with a quiet, cutting calm, as if he were finally seeing the truth about the man who had been standing in front of him all along. His reply came measured, unshaken. "The kitchen may be yours. But this extraordinary woman is no longer." The words hung heavy in the air, the silence that followed sharp enough to cut through, and for the first time I saw Sanders falter, his swagger collapsing into nothing. I stood there in the center of it all, my scar exposed, my hands still smelling of onions and lemon, and for the first time in years I felt the weight shift back toward me. The older man turned to his colleagues, his voice steady but final. "I believe we found what we came for. I see no reason to attach ourselves to this place." They nodded, one after another, their agreement swift and certain. The younger investor leaned toward his assistant without sparing Sanders a glance, instructing him to draft a buyout at the lowest possible offer, confident the man would sign once he realized the only value had already walked out of his reach. Another voice added with firm authority, "Let him take his pennies. We don't want his diner, his crew, or him. Without him." Sanders tried to form a protest, his lips moving but his voice small and pathetic, instantly drowned out by the silver-haired man's final repetition. "Without him." Those two words struck like a gavel, closing the matter with no appeal, and in that instant the room shifted fully away from Sanders and toward me. Then the older man turned back to me, his eyes softening as if to counterbalance the steel that had just silenced Sanders. He studied me with something between respect and invitation, and his words carried a quiet gravity that landed deep inside me. "Ms. Moore, it's time to begin our work." My heart stumbled in my chest at the weight of it. Not a job offer, but a lifeline, a resurrection spoken aloud. A week later, I was on a train heading north, my face reflected faintly in the window as golden fields, dirt roads, and weathered farmhouses blurred past, dissolving into the fog of autumn. I pressed a cotton handkerchief between my fingers, remembering the grease, the shouting, the despair I had left behind, and I felt a cautious peace take its place. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was something steadier, a quiet promise that after losing everything, I was finally on my way back to myself. What lay ahead was unknown, maybe even terrifying, but it felt alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. Behind me, I was leaving the smoke-stained ceilings, the clatter of greasy pots, the barking voices, and the endless small cruelties I had learned to endure. I sat by the train window, a cotton handkerchief balled between my fingers, watching the blur of fields and weathered barns roll past in the autumn haze. My thoughts circled like restless birds. What strange, crooked roads we sometimes travel just to come back to ourselves. Not to the old version, not the woman who had been polished, photographed, applauded, but the one who rises quietly, steadily, relentlessly, until she knows she belongs to herself again. My mind drifted back to that last night in the diner, to Jake, the young waiter who had dashed around for wine and lemons like it was a quest. He had caught up with me at the door, flushed and stumbling over his words, but his eyes shining with something real. "I hate that you're leaving," he blurted, "but now I want to learn too, to cook like you, to make people feel amazed." His voice cracked, clumsy but sincere, and I saw in him the spark I thought I'd lost forever. I smiled, touched his shoulder, and simply wished him luck. The way he nodded then, awkward and stunned, was like watching someone suddenly believe they had permission to dream bigger than the life they'd been handed. And then there was Emily, my sister, waiting at the station. She didn't try to fill the moment with speeches. She just held me tight, her arms strong around me, as if she could shield me from the weight of the years behind me. Only at the last second, as she pulled back, did she whisper, "Don't be afraid anymore. You've already survived the worst." My eyes burned, but I only nodded, stepping onto the train without looking back. Now the wheels beat a steady rhythm beneath me, rocking me forward, carrying me into a future I couldn't yet picture but was ready to meet. For the first time in years, I let myself breathe, and in that quiet, I felt the faint but certain pulse of hope. I closed my eyes and, for the first time in what felt like forever, let a smile find its way across my face. The rhythm of the train carried me forward, steady and certain, and the road ahead, unknown as it was, felt wide open. Behind me, I was leaving scars and smoke and silence, but inside, there was finally peace. For the first time in years, I wasn't running from the past. I was moving toward the future. And if this story touched you, even just a little, I'd love to know. Leave me a comment. Tell me how it made you feel. Maybe share if it reminded you of something in your own life. Don't forget to hit that like button. It helps more than you know. And if you want to hear more stories like this, go ahead and subscribe. This way you'll always be here with me for the next chapter.